Hi, everyone. Welcome to another segment on Chapter 11. In this segment, we look at the second model of imperfect competition, and that model is called oligopoly. So what we're going to do is look at characteristics. How is oligopoly different from monopolistic competition? We're going to talk about what collusion is. That's a significant trait of oligopolies at times, although it is illegal. And we're going to cover something called game theory, which highlights one of the characteristics of oligopoly, which is mutual interdependence between the players. Then in the next segment, we'll go on to collusive and non-collusive oligopolies. So as we look at the characteristics of oligopoly, we're going to, compare them to monopolistic competition, as well as perfect competition, as well as monopoly. And that will help sort of distinguish and differentiate just what oligopoly is. So first and foremost, oligopoly is dominated by a few large firms, not many firms like monopolistic competition, but just a few large ones. High concentration ratios in oligopolistic industries. Things like the automobile manufacturing industry, right? You can list off the big automobile manufacturing companies. Things like the camera companies, Nikon, Canon, there's only a few of those. Or of course, our favorite example is the cell phone companies in Canada, Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. So those are oligopoly firms or oligopoly industries. And let's not forget the oil industry is still dominated by a few major players, and that's an oligopoly as well. The entry of new firms is difficult. There are some barriers to entry, like huge economies of scale that have been achieved by existing firms. Not as many barriers to entry as there is in a monopoly, but it usually requires very deep pockets, have a lot of extra cash to invest to start up and compete with these large oligopoly firms. So entry of new firms is difficult. In monopolistic competition, there was ease of entry. But entry of new firms is difficult, which is a trait borrowed from the monopoly side of things. And we note that non-price competition between firms is widely practiced. And by non-price competition, we usually associate advertising in here. And we looked at advertising earlier in this chapter about advertising on location, advertising about service, advertising through symbols or things that represent your company, things like that. But non-price competition is widely practiced here because they don't want to get into big price wars, but they still do sometimes compete on price. Each firm has significant control over its price, not total control like a monopolist would, but significant control because they're pretty big players and there's only a few of them. And if their products are somewhat differentiated, they'll have even more control over the price. However, we will see that in some cases, oligopolies really don't want to compete on price. They don't want to change its price much. Probably the strongest characteristic of oligopoly is a mutual interdependence existing between firms. In other words, one firm is constantly looking over its shoulder at what the other firm is going to do. And this distinguishes an oligopoly probably more than all the other traits, is where one firm is very much concerned and makes its own plans based on what it thinks other companies might be wanting to do. Earlier in the session, we were talking about homogeneous or differentiated products, and oligopoly can have either. We defined that way back when we started Perfect Competition and we had a table about all the different market structures. We said their products could be homogeneous, like steel, the example they give there, but also like aluminum producers or lumber producers. They're all pretty much identical products, but they are produced by great big companies. Or they could be differentiated products like automobiles. They have very different types of automobiles are produced. The Canadian banks are somewhat of an oligopoly with a differentiated product. Cell phone plans are trying to have differentiated products. Airlines try and have differentiated products as well. Mutual interdependence, as we stated, was the biggest or probably the most predominant trait of oligopolies, where they're constantly looking over their shoulder to what their competitor is doing because they know very well who the competitor is. Remember, these are just a few large companies. So mutual interdependence is the condition in which a firm's actions depend on the reactions of the other firms. So a firm's actions depend in part, at least, on the reactions of its rival firms, the firms that it competes with. We're going to look at a model that shows this mutual interdependence. But first, let's define something called collusion. Now, collusion is agreement among producers or suppliers, either to set the quantity that they're each going to produce or to set the price of a product. But they have to act together to come out with this agreement, and hopefully they stick to it. It's illegal in most countries. You're not allowed to collude because it usually works against consumers. And this type of action may or may not be successful, as we'll see when we take a look at this thing called game theory. And game theory is a method of analyzing firm behavior, and it highlights the characteristic that we just said was the most important one, or the most predominant characteristic of oligopoly, and that is mutual interdependence. The fact that one company relies pretty much on its decisions based on what the other companies are doing or what it thinks the other companies might do. That's mutual interdependence. Something called game theory highlights this mutual interaction or mutual interdependence between firms. And the Nash equilibrium, that's a situation where each rival chooses the best actions given the anticipated actions of the others. So that's that mutual interdependence thing here. And we can just start out by saying Aman was granted ownership of a well in the desert and basically can sell 50 jugs of water at $5 each, so making $250 per day, say. But then Omar finds a water well and a price war erupts between them. So Omar's down here. So they come to an agreement. They come to a collusive agreement. And what happens is if they each honor the arrangement, they're each going to sell 25 jugs at $5 each. So they're each going to get $125. Fine, that's if the collusive agreement works. But then Aman starts thinking, you know what? If I don't cheat, I get 125. But if I do cheat and produce more units, I can lower the price. And so I'll get 140, but Omar will only get 100. So Aman's saying, hey, you know what? It's better for me to cheat as long as Omar doesn't. But wait a sec. What if Omar cheats and Aman doesn't? Then Omar gets the 140 and Aman only gets 100. So in which case Aman stops and thinks, well, if Omar cheats, I know I'm only going to get 100. So why don't I cheat too? And the price drops even further, but it works out that Aman gets 105 and Omar gets 105 if they both cheat. And you can do the math in the textbook to get at those numbers. But the upshot is then Aman sits back and says, well, you know what? If Omar doesn't cheat and I don't, I get 125. But if I do, I get 140. So you know what? I think I might like to cheat if Omar doesn't. But wait a sec. What if Omar does cheat? Well, then Aman only gets 100. But if they also cheat, they get 105. So in both cases, Aman would rather cheat because compared to the non-cheat amount, they make more by cheating. So whether or not Omar cheats or doesn't cheat, Aman comes to the conclusion he should cheat because he's going to make more no matter what situation it is. So that arrives into a situation where each rival will choose the best actions. And in this case, they will cheat because Omar looks at it exactly the same way as Aman does and come to the same conclusion that Omar should cheat as well. So that's the Nash equilibrium, and it highlights mutual interdependence. And in this case, it shows that collusion, although it starts out, if it's successful collusion, that's the best solution for both of them. But if they consider the action of their rivals and there's a strong tendency to cheat in these arrangements, then it will work out that they both end up cheating and they both end up making the 105. They look at that as their best alternative, and that's the Nash equilibrium. So this example shows that if it's a successful collusion and they both don't cheat, this would be the solution. But the tendency to cheat is pretty strong, so the likely solution will be that they both end up cheating and they both end up in this particular solution. Now let's take a look at a slightly different type of mutual interdependence. And this interdependence we're going to look at is, say, two firms dominate the running shoes industry. This is just an example here. One of them hires a sports figure. So strong mutual interdependence in this industry highlighted again. What would the other firm do in response? One of them hires a sports figure to endorse the product. Well, the other one is likely going to respond by hiring a similar type of sports figure in an endorsement deal. That's what game theory would suggest. That's mutual interdependence among this oligopoly. After the second one also engages a sports figure for a similar endorsement type of deal, what market share would each firm have? Probably pretty much the same. If the second firm got on there really quickly, which they often would, the relative market share would probably remain unchanged from where it was initially. And so given that they both might know that, and they both know the cost of hiring a sports figure, what might they be tempted to do? And they might be tempted to come to a collusive agreement, avoiding hiring a sports figure for either one of them. And that would be a very illegal thing to do. Companies like that aren't supposed to agree because that will affect prices, it affects profits, affects quantity that's produced, and it hurts the consumer. So they would be tempted to come to an agreement like that. But remember, collusive agreements are highly illegal inside particular countries. So that's it for this small market segment on chapter 11 that I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to request that you go to the textbook to read a little bit more detail on the game theory and this particular example in particular, just to understand kind of what's going on behind it and make sure that it makes sense to you where the collusive solution is, and if the collusion breaks down, under what conditions, and then what solution would be the best one after that. In the next segment, we're going to go on to another one on oligopoly, and we're going to formally talk about collusive oligopolies as well as non-collusive oligopolies. And we'll see you when we get there.